The moment Ethan Cole saw the woman step off that train with three hungry children clinging to her skirts, he knew his carefully constructed life was about to shatter. He'd come to send them away, to protect himself from the pain of caring, of losing, of becoming the fool who loved and lost again. But when her eyes met his across that dusty platform, tired but unbroken, something ancient and buried stirred in his chest. "I've got room for 4," he heard himself say, the words escaping before his mind could cage them. It was a lie. He had no room at all. Before we begin this journey through the Texas frontier, where one cowboy's fortress of solitude crumbles beneath the weight of unexpected family, I invite you to stay with me until the very end. If this story touches your heart, hit that like button and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these tales travel. Now, let's step back to where it all began. The Texas sun hung low and merciless over the Cole Ranch, turning the dust to gold and the shadows to ink. Ethan Cole stood on his porch, a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape that surrounded him, 25 years old but carrying the weight of twice that many. His hands, calloused and scarred, gripped a letter that had arrived 3 days prior, the paper now soft from repeated readings, as if the words might change if he looked enough times. They hadn't changed. "Mr. Cole, I regret to inform you of the passing of Thomas Rowan, distant cousin to your late mother. His widow, Clara Rowan, and her 3 children will be arriving in Briscoe on the 15th of September. As Mr. Rowan's only living relative in Texas, we trust you will provide appropriate assistance during this difficult transition." Appropriate assistance. The word sat bitter on his tongue. Ethan folded the letter and shoved it into his vest pocket, his jaw tight. He'd built this ranch with his own hands, every fence post driven into the hard earth like a stake claiming territory against the chaos of the world. After his parents died, his father to influenza, his mother to the heartbreak that followed, he'd learned the essential truth of frontier life. Attachment was a luxury that cost more than most men could afford. He was 12 when he'd found himself alone. 12 when he'd watched neighbors he'd trusted ride off with half his family's livestock, claiming his father had owed debts that didn't exist. 12 when he'd learned that people would take everything you had if you weren't strong enough to stop them, and that the only person you could truly rely on was yourself. The years that followed had been hard education. He'd worked ranches from the Panhandle to San Antonio, sleeping in bunkhouses where men shared space but never trust, where friendships were as temporary as the seasons and twice as changeable. He'd saved every coin, every dollar, building towards something that belonged only to him, a place where he made the rules, where he controlled who came and who went. And now this. A widow and 3 children, arriving like a debt called due from a past he'd barely known existed. Ethan walked to the barn, his boots raising small clouds with each step. The ranch spread before him in the fading light, modest but sufficient. 200 acres of grazing land, a sturdy house he'd built room by room, a barn that smelled of hay and leather and honest work. It was clean, ordered, predictable. It was exactly what he'd wanted. It was built for one. Inside the barn, his mare, Sable, nickered softly as he approached her stall. He ran a hand down her neck, feeling the warmth of her, the solid reality of muscle and bone. "What do you think, girl?" he murmured. "Should I meet this train tomorrow, or should I just let fate handle it?" Sable snorted, unimpressed with his philosophizing. The truth was, he'd already decided. Duty, that old iron word, had its hooks in him whether he liked it or not. His mother had spoken of the Rowans once or twice, distant family back east that she'd lost touch with after heading west with his father. Some thread of obligation, thin as spider silk but just as persistent, pulled at him. He would meet the train. He would offer directions to cheap lodging, perhaps some money if they were destitute. He would do what was necessary, and then he would return to his life, his solitude, his carefully maintained distance from the complications that other people represented. That was the plan. Simple, clean, safe. The town of Briscoe squatted on the prairie like a collection of children's blocks scattered by a careless hand. Main Street, a generous term for a dirt road flanked by false-fronted buildings, ran straight through the center, connecting the railroad station on the east end to the church on the west. In between, a general store, a saloon, a hotel that had seen better decades, and a scattering of homes where families tried to carve civilization from stubborn earth. Ethan rode in just after noon, tying Sable to the hitching post outside Miller's General Store. The train wasn't due until 3, but he'd come early, telling himself it was to pick up supplies, not because nervous energy had driven him from the ranch at dawn. "Ethan Cole, as I live and breathe," Martha Miller's voice boomed from the store's doorway. She was a formidable woman, wide as a wagon and twice as sturdy, with eyes that missed nothing and a tongue that shared everything. "Heard you've got family coming in on the afternoon train." Ethan removed his hat as he stepped onto the wooden sidewalk. News travels fast. News is about all that travels fast in this town, and you know it. Martha wiped her hands on her apron, her expression shifting to something almost maternal. "It's good, Ethan. A man shouldn't live alone out there. It's not natural." "They're not staying," he said, more sharply than he intended. "Just passing through. Thought I'd point them toward cheap lodging, maybe help them get situated somewhere." Martha's eyebrows rose. "Somewhere? You mean somewhere that isn't your ranch that's got empty bedrooms and space to spare?" "I've got a working ranch to run, Martha. I can't—" He stopped, hearing the defensiveness in his own voice. "It's not set up for children. Nothing's set up for children until children arrive. Then you make it work." She studied him with the unnerving directness of someone who'd known him since he was barely taller than her counter. "Your mother would have taken them in without a second thought." The mention of his mother landed like a physical blow, but Ethan kept his expression neutral. "My mother's been gone 13 years. I'm not her." "No," Martha agreed softly. "You're not. But you're not the hard man you pretend to be either, Ethan Cole. I've seen you with the Henderson kids when you think no one's watching. I've seen you fix Tom Wheeler's fence after that storm, not asking for a thing in return. You've got your father's hands and your mother's heart, whether you admit it or not." Ethan turned away, ostensibly to examine a display of canned goods. "I need 10 pounds of flour, 5 of sugar, and coffee, if you've got it fresh." Martha sighed but didn't push further. As she gathered his supplies, Ethan found his gaze drifting to the window, toward the train station visible at the end of the street. A knot of anxiety tightened in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation. He was a man who faced down storms, handled difficult livestock, dealt with cattle thieves without flinching. But the thought of 4 strangers disrupting his carefully ordered world filled him with something close to panic. "Ethan?" Martha's voice pulled him back. "They're just people. Probably scared, definitely tired, almost certainly in need of kindness. Whatever you decide to do, don't let fear make the choice for you." He paid for his supplies without responding, loading them into Sable's saddlebags with mechanical precision. But Martha's words followed him as he led his horse down the street, echoing in the hollow space behind his ribs. Don't let fear make the choice. As if it were that simple. As if fear weren't the most reliable guide he'd ever known, the instinct that had kept him alive and independent when softer emotions would have destroyed him. The train station was little more than a covered platform and a small office where the station master, old Henry Briggs, spent his days dozing between arrivals. Ethan positioned himself at the far end of the platform, leaning against a post, hat pulled low. A handful of other people waited. A merchant expecting inventory, a young couple meeting relatives, a drifter hoping for work. At precisely 3:15, the train's whistle cut through the afternoon heat, a sound both mournful and insistent. Ethan straightened despite himself, his hands unconsciously smoothing his vest, checking that his shirt was tucked in properly. He felt ridiculous, primping like some schoolboy before a dance, but couldn't seem to stop himself. The train emerged from the heat shimmer like something from a dream, all iron and steam and progress, a marvel of engineering that connected this dusty outpost to the wider world. It shuddered to a stop with a hiss of brakes and a cloud of steam that briefly obscured the platform. When the steam cleared, people began to disembark. Ethan scanned the faces, looking for what exactly? He had no idea what Clara Rowan looked like, no description beyond widow with 3 children. His eyes passed over the merchant's crates, the young couple embracing their visitors, a salesman with an oversized case. And then he saw her. She stood on the bottom step of the passenger car, one hand gripping the rail, the other holding a carpet bag that had seen better years. She wore a dark blue traveling dress, faded at the hem but clean and carefully mended. Her hair, somewhere between brown and auburn, was pulled back beneath a simple bonnet. But it was her face that stopped him, young, perhaps 23 or 24, with features that might have been called pretty if they hadn't been so drawn with exhaustion and something harder to name. Not grief exactly, though there was that too. Something more like resolution. The face of someone who had made difficult decisions and would make more without flinching. Behind her, 3 children descended the steps in careful succession. The oldest was a boy, maybe 9 or 10, with dark hair and serious eyes that swept the platform with an alertness beyond his years. He carried a battered trunk between himself and a smaller boy, 7, perhaps, whose face was softer, more open, touched with wonder despite the obvious fatigue. The youngest was a girl, no more than 5, clinging to her mother's skirt with one hand while the other clutched a rag doll with such fierce protectiveness that Ethan felt something twist in his chest. They looked small. Impossibly small against the vast Texas sky, against the enormity of the journey they'd made, against the uncertainty of whatever future awaited them. Clara Rowan's eyes swept the platform, and Ethan recognized the look immediately, the way her gaze passed over faces, assessing, cataloging, looking for danger or for safety. He couldn't tell which. When her eyes found his, there was a moment of connection, brief as lightning, before she looked away, continuing her survey. She hadn't recognized him. Of course she hadn't. They'd never met, had no way of knowing each other. He was just another stranger in a town full of them. Ethan pushed off from the post and started toward her, his heart beating with an unfamiliar rhythm. Up close, she was smaller than he'd thought, barely reaching his shoulder, but there was nothing fragile about the way she held herself. She'd set down her carpet bag and was kneeling beside the youngest child, adjusting the girl's bonnet, murmuring something that made the little one nod solemnly. "Mrs. Rowan." She looked up sharply, and Ethan found himself on the receiving end of a gaze that was both cautious and intelligent, taking his measure in a heartbeat. "Yes?" Her voice was clear, educated, with traces of the East Coast softening the vowels. "I'm Ethan Cole." He removed his hat, suddenly aware of how rough he must look, unshaven, wearing work clothes, smelling of horse and leather. "Thomas Rowan was my mother's cousin. I received a letter about your circumstances." Something flickered across her face. Relief, he thought, quickly suppressed. She stood, brushing dust from her skirt, and offered her hand like a man would, direct and firm. "Mr. Cole, that's kind of you to come." Her handshake was brief but solid. "I apologize for any inconvenience. The lawyer in Philadelphia said you might be able to direct us to affordable lodging. We don't mean to impose." The boys had moved closer, flanking their mother protectively. The older one's eyes were hard, distrustful. He'd seen too much, that one, learned too young that the world wasn't kind. The smaller boy looked curious but cautious, while the little girl had half hidden behind her mother's skirts, peering out at Ethan like he might be a bear in disguise. "This is Samuel," Clara said, touching the older boy's shoulder. "And Noah." The younger boy nodded. "And Lily." "Ma'am," Ethan began, then stopped. He'd prepared a speech on the ride into town, carefully worded directions to the boarding house, an offer of money to help them get started. But standing here, seeing the exhaustion in her face, the protective way she kept her children close, the thin fabric of her dress that spoke of reduced circumstances and hard choices, the words died in his throat. Behind them, the train whistled, preparing to depart. Other passengers had collected their belongings and dispersed. The platform was emptying, and soon it would be just them, standing in the harsh afternoon sun with nowhere to go. Ethan looked at the children again. The little girl's doll was missing an arm. The boys' shirts, though clean, had been mended multiple times. Samuel's shoes were too small, the leather cracked. These were children who'd known want, who'd learned to make do with less than enough. Something old and buried shifted inside him. His mother's voice, a memory so faint it was more feeling than words. "We help our own, Ethan, always." But they weren't his own. They were strangers, complications, responsibilities he'd spent years ensuring he'd never have to shoulder. Taking them in would mean noise where there'd been silence, chaos where there'd been order, need where there'd been self-sufficiency. It would mean caring, and caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. Mr. Cole, Claire's voice was patient but firm. If you could just point us toward, I've got room for 4. The words came out before he could stop them, rough and abrupt, surprising him as much as her. Clara blinked, her composure cracking for just a moment. I beg your pardon? At my ranch. Ethan cleared his throat, trying to sound more certain than he felt. It's about an hour's ride, got spare bedrooms, plenty of space. You're welcome to stay until you figure out your next step. It was a mistake. Every instinct he'd honed over 13 years of careful solitude screamed at him to take the words back, to retreat behind the walls he'd built. But he couldn't seem to do it. Not with those children looking up at him with eyes that had seen too little kindness. Clara studied him for a long moment, and Ethan forced himself to meet her gaze steadily. He saw the calculation there, a woman weighing risk against necessity, pride against practical need. That's very generous, Mr. Cole, but it's not generosity, he interrupted, harsher than he intended. It's practical. You need a place. I've got space. Simple arrangement until you get your bearings. He could see her weighing his words, looking for the trap, the hidden cost. She'd learned that too, he realized, learned that nothing came free, that kindness usually wore a price tag. We can pay, she said quietly. Not much, but didn't ask for payment. Ethan bent to pick up her carpet bag before she could protest. Got a wagon at the livery. I'll collect it and meet you back here. 10 minutes. He walked away before she could argue, before he could change his mind, before the full weight of what he'd just done could crash down on him. His hands shook slightly as he untied Sable's reins, and he had to pause, pressing his forehead against the mare's warm neck, trying to slow his racing heart. What had he done? 10 minutes later, he pulled up to the platform driving a wagon he rarely used, meant for hauling supplies but serviceable for passengers. Clara and her children stood exactly where he'd left them, their meager belongings gathered around them like a fortress wall. When he climbed down to help load their trunks, Samuel stepped forward quickly. I can do it, sir. Samuel? Clara's voice was gentle but firm. Let Mr. Cole help. The boy stepped back reluctantly, his jaw tight. Ethan recognized that look, the need to be useful, to be strong, to protect. He'd worn that same expression at 12 years old, defying neighbors who'd tried to send him to an orphanage. The trunks were surprisingly light. Everything they owned, Ethan realized, fit into 2 small trunks and 3 carpet bags. A family's entire life reduced to what could be carried. He helped Clara onto the wagon seat, then lifted the little girl, Lily, up beside her mother. The child weighed almost nothing, all bones and wide eyes. The boys clambered into the back, settling among their belongings with the practiced ease of children who'd moved before, who knew how to make themselves small and unobtrusive. As Ethan climbed up beside Clara and took the reins, he caught her looking at him again, that same assessing gaze. Why? She asked quietly. Why what? Why offer us room? You don't know us, we're strangers. Ethan flicked the reins, setting the wagon in motion. The question deserved honesty, but he wasn't sure he had an honest answer. Because of duty, because of memory, because something in her eyes had reached past his defenses? My mother, he finally said, used to say that family helps family, even distant family, even when it's inconvenient. And do you believe that, Mr. Cole? He was quiet for a long moment, guiding the wagon out of town, toward the open prairie where his ranch waited. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. I'm not sure what I believe, he admitted, but I know what's right. Beside him, Clara said nothing, but when he glanced over, he saw something in her face that might have been relief, or might have been hope, or might have been simple exhaustion finally allowed to show. In the back of the wagon, the children were silent, watching the landscape unfold, mile after mile of grass and sky, a vastness that must have seemed both terrifying and full of possibility. And Ethan, who had spent 13 years building walls around his heart, felt the first cracks beginning to form. The ride to the ranch took longer than usual. Ethan kept the pace easy, aware of how the children swayed with the wagon's movement, how Lily had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder within the first mile. The sun tracked west, throwing long shadows across the prairie, and a breeze had picked up, bringing the scent of sage and distant rain. Clara sat beside him in silence for most of the journey, her attention on the landscape. Ethan found himself acutely aware of her presence, the way she held herself straight despite obvious fatigue, the small adjustments she made to keep Lily comfortable as the child slept, the occasional glances she cast toward the back of the wagon to check on her sons. "How long is the journey from Philadelphia?" he asked, more to break the silence than from curiosity. 6 days by train." Clara's voice was quiet, mindful of the sleeping child. "Though it feels longer." "I imagine it does." Another silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable, but not hostile either. Ethan searched for something else to say, but small talk had never been his strength. He was better with horses than people, more fluent in the language of work than social niceties. "The lawyer said Thomas was your mother's cousin," Clara said after a while. "Did you know him?" "Never met him. My mother mentioned the family occasionally, but they lost touch after she married my father and headed west. That would have been 30 years ago, maybe more." "Thomas spoke of family in Texas," Clara said, "but never with much detail. I think the distance made it seem almost mythical. The West, cowboys, ranches, like something from a dime novel rather than real life." "It's real enough." Ethan gestured toward the landscape around them. "Sometimes more real than people are ready for." "Yes." Something in her voice suggested she understood exactly what he meant. "I'm learning that." In the back of the wagon, he heard the boys talking in low voices. "Do you think there will be Indians?" That was Noah, the younger one, excitement barely contained. "Don't be stupid." Samuel's voice was sharp with the particular cruelty of older brothers. "The Indians are gone, or locked up in reservations. Everyone knows that." "Some are," Noah insisted. "But Papa said there were still bands in Texas living free. Papa said a lot of things that weren't true." The silence that followed was heavy, weighted with more than Ethan could interpret. He saw Clara's hands tighten on her daughter's sleeping form. "Samuel." Her voice was quiet, but carried an edge of warning. "That's enough." "Yes, ma'am." The boy's voice had gone flat, all the earlier fire snuffed out. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was working. There was a story there, in the way Samuel spoke, in the bitterness that seemed too old for his young face. A story about Thomas Rowan, and maybe about why these four were alone in the world. "Your husband," Ethan began carefully, then stopped. "I'm sorry for your loss." Clara was quiet for so long he thought she might not respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, careful. "Thank you. Thomas was... he tried. Things didn't always work out the way he planned, but he tried." It was a strange eulogy, notable more for what it didn't say than what it did. Ethan filed it away, another piece of the puzzle that was Clara Rowan and her children. The land began to change as they drew closer to his ranch, the flat prairie giving way to gentle rolls, a creek cutting through the earth, cottonwood trees marking its path. Ethan felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always came when he neared home, a possessive, protective feeling, like a wolf returning to its den. "There," he said, pointing ahead where buildings emerged from the landscape. "The Cole Ranch." Clara straightened, her eyes following his gesture. Even in the fading light, Ethan could see it clearly. The house he'd built board by board, the barn with its sturdy doors, the corral where his horses grazed. It looked small against the vastness of the prairie, but it was solid, real, entirely his. Or it had been, until 10 minutes ago. As they approached, one of his ranch hands, Miguel Reyes, who helped during busy seasons, emerged from the barn. His eyebrows rose at the sight of passengers in Ethan's wagon, but he was too well trained to comment. "Miguel," Ethan called as he pulled the wagon to a stop. "We've got gas. Mrs. Rowan and her children will be staying for a while." "Sí, patron." Miguel moved forward to help with the trunks, his face carefully neutral. "I'll put the horses away for the night." "Appreciate it." Ethan climbed down and moved to help Clara, but she'd already descended on her own, Lily stirring in her arms. The boys jumped down from the back, landing in small clouds of dust. They stood close together, taking in their surroundings with wide eyes. The house stood before them, single story, built from local timber and stone, with a porch that wrapped around the front. Nothing fancy, but weather-tight and solid. Ethan found himself seeing it through their eyes and felt suddenly self-conscious about its plainness, the lack of decoration, the purely functional nature of every feature. "It's not much," he heard himself say. "It's shelter," Claire replied simply, "and that's more than enough." Ethan led them inside, lighting lamps as the dusk deepened into night. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room combined, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. 2 doors led off to the bedrooms he'd added as the ranch prospered. One he used, one that had stood empty except for storing extra supplies. The house felt different with people in it. The air itself seemed to shift, becoming fuller somehow, less hollow. Footsteps echoed on the wooden floors. The boys' whispered conversation added texture to the silence that usually pressed against the walls. "The bedroom's through there," Ethan said, indicating one of the doors. "It's not fancy, but there's a bed big enough for you and the little one, and the boys can use bedrolls on the floor until we figure out something better." Clara set Lily down gently, the child's eyes fluttering open. "Say thank you to Mr. Cole, sweetheart." "Thank you," Lily whispered, so quietly Ethan almost didn't hear it. "You're welcome, miss." He felt awkward, too large for the space, uncertain what to do with his hands. "I'll bring in your trunks. Samuel and I can help." Clara began removing her bonnet. "The boys are stronger than they look." "I don't doubt it, but please, Mr. Cole." She met his eyes directly. "We may be accepting your hospitality, but we're not helpless. Let us contribute where we can." There was pride in her voice, a line she was drawing. Ethan recognized it because he'd drawn similar lines himself. The need to maintain dignity even when circumstances tried to strip it away. "All right," he said. "Samuel, you take that end." Together they hauled the trunks inside, the boy working with grim determination, clearly trying to prove something. When everything was stacked in the bedroom, Clara began organizing immediately, her movements efficient, practiced. "There's a well out back for water," Ethan said from the doorway. "Privy's beyond that. I'll leave you to get settled. If you're hungry, there's bread and cheese in the pantry, and I can make coffee. We'll manage, Mr. Cole. You've done more than enough already." Clara glanced at him over her shoulder. "Thank you, truly." Ethan nodded and retreated, pulling the door partially closed to give them privacy. He stood in the main room of his house that suddenly felt like someone else's, and listened to the sounds of a family settling in. Lily's soft questions, Clara's gentle responses, the boys moving around, the creak of the trunk lids opening. He should feel invaded. He should feel resentful. Instead, he felt something closer to disorientation, like the world had tilted slightly and he was still finding his balance. Moving to the kitchen area, Ethan began preparing a simple meal, more to give himself something to do than from hunger. As he sliced bread and laid out cheese, he tried to imagine what the next days would bring. How long would they stay? What would figuring out their next step entail? And why, despite every logical reason to regret his impulsive invitation, did some part of him, the part he'd spent years trying to silence, feel almost relieved that his house wasn't empty tonight? The bedroom door opened, and Samuel emerged. The boy had removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, and Ethan noticed how thin his arms were, how his wrists jutted from the cuffs like knobs. "Sir?" Samuel's voice was formal, carefully polite. "My mother asked if you needed help with supper. I've got it handled, but you can tell her there's food ready when you're hungry." The boy didn't move. He stood in the doorway, shifting his weight, clearly wanting to say something but not sure how. "Something else on your mind?" Ethan asked. Samuel's jaw worked for a moment, then, "How long can we stay?" The directness caught Ethan off guard. He'd expected gratitude, maybe questions about the ranch, not this blunt inquiry. "Long as you need," he found himself saying. "Within reason." "What's reason?" "Samuel." Clara had appeared in the doorway behind her son. "That's not appropriate." "I'm just asking." "I know what you're asking." She put a hand on the boy's shoulder, her voice gentler. "But we've imposed enough for one day. Let's not press our host's generosity. It's all right, Ethan said. He's got a right to know where he stands. Boys should be able to ask questions. Clara's eyes met his, and he saw something shift there. A reassessment, perhaps, or a slight relaxation of her guard. The answer, Ethan continued, looking at Samuel, is that you can stay until your mother figures out what comes next. Could be a week, could be longer. We'll work it out as we go. Samuel nodded slowly, processing this. And you want us to work? To earn our keep? Samuel, Clara's cheeks flushed. We discussed this. A man works for what he gets, the boy said stubbornly. That's what Papa always said. Even when he didn't. He stopped abruptly, his face closing off. Even when he didn't. The unfinished sentence hung in the air. Your papa was right, Ethan said carefully. Working for what you get is honorable, but so is accepting help when you need it. There's no shame in either. He saw Clara's surprise, quickly hidden. Samuel looked less certain, as if this philosophy didn't quite fit with whatever worldview he'd developed. For now, Ethan continued, let's just focus on you getting settled. Tomorrow's soon enough to talk about chores and such, if you're interested. I'm interested, Samuel said immediately. Then we'll talk tomorrow. Ethan gestured toward the table where he'd laid out the simple meal. Come eat. Growing boys need food. They gathered around the table, an event that had never happened in this house before. Ethan had always eaten alone, usually standing at the counter or out on the porch, food consumed as fuel rather than ritual. But now there was Clara sitting across from him, Lily in her lap picking at a piece of bread, and the boys flanking her like guards. The meal was quiet at first, everyone too tired for much conversation, but gradually small exchanges emerged. Noah asked about the horses in the corral. Lily wanted to know if there were chickens. Samuel said nothing but ate with focused intensity, as if each bite were precious and might be taken away. Ethan watched them, couldn't help watching them, these strangers who'd become his responsibility in the span of an afternoon. Clara ate carefully, her manners refined even in her exhaustion. She'd been raised with some means, he guessed, had known better circumstances before whatever had brought her to his door. The bedroom, Clara said as the meal wound down. You said you'd figure out something better for the boys? There's lumber in the barn, Ethan said. Could build a couple of proper beds. Wouldn't take more than a few days. That's not necessary. It's necessary if they're staying more than a night or two. He met her gaze steadily. I don't do things halfway, Mrs. Rowan. If you're here proper, not camping out on my floor like vagrants. Color rose in her cheeks again, but this time with what might have been gratitude. Then we'll help build them. The boys can learn, and You can rest, Ethan interrupted. You look dead on your feet, if you'll pardon me saying so. I'm fine. You're exhausted. He gentled his tone. There's no prize for running yourself into the ground, Mrs. Rowan. Take the help that's offered. She looked at him for a long moment, and Ethan saw the internal war, pride against weariness, independence against necessity. Finally, something in her softened. All right, she said quietly. But tomorrow we contribute. I won't have my children growing up thinking the world owes them something. Fair enough? After the meal, Clara herded the children toward the bedroom. Lily was already half asleep again, and Noah's eyes were heavy. Even Samuel's rigid posture had begun to slump with fatigue. At the bedroom door, Clara paused and turned back. Mr. Cole, thank you for all of this. For all. I know we're disrupting your life, and I'm sorry for that. But I'm also grateful. More than I can properly express. No need for gratitude, Ethan said, uncomfortable with the emotion in her voice. Just get some rest. She nodded and disappeared into the bedroom, the door closing softly behind her. Alone again, Ethan stood in the center of his house and listened to the sounds of settling, muffled voices, the creak of bed springs, water being poured for washing. Sounds he'd never heard in this space before. Sounds that made the house feel both more full and more foreign. He should go to bed himself. Dawn came early on a ranch, and there was always work waiting, but instead he found himself stepping out onto the porch, into the cool night air. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by city lights, scattered across the darkness like spilled salt. Ethan had spent countless nights on this porch, finding peace in the solitude, in the clean simplicity of his life. But tonight the solitude felt different. Not peaceful, but lonely. Not simple, but empty. He thought about what he'd done, inviting these people into his home, into his carefully constructed existence. It was reckless. It was foolish. It violated every principle of self-preservation he'd developed. And yet, when he thought about sending them away, about watching that wagon pull out tomorrow morning, something in his chest tightened with what felt uncomfortably like regret. "What did I just do?" he murmured to the darkness. The darkness, as always, offered no answers. But from inside the house came a small sound, a child's laughter, quickly hushed, followed by a mother's gentle scolding. Human sounds, family sounds, sounds that had no place in the life Ethan Cole had built. Sounds that, despite everything, made his house feel less like a fortress and more like a home. He stayed on the porch long into the night, wrestling with questions he couldn't answer, feeling the first tremors of change he couldn't stop, and wondering, not for the first time that day and certainly not for the last, what he'd set in motion with 4 simple words. "I've got room for 4." Dawn came to the Cole ranch the way it always did. Gradually, then all at once, the darkness bleeding into gray, and then gold as the sun crested the horizon. Ethan had been awake for an hour already, a lifetime of habit making sleep past 5 impossible. He'd dressed quietly, made coffee, and stepped out to begin the morning chores, expecting the house behind him to remain silent for hours yet. He was wrong. The sound of the back door opening made him turn from the chicken coop, an egg basket in one hand. Clara stood on the porch, already dressed, her hair pinned up in a practical bun. She'd changed from yesterday's traveling dress into something simpler, worn but clean, with an apron tied at her waist. "Mrs. Rowan." Ethan walked toward the house, surprised. "You're up early." "I've never been one for sleeping late, Mr. Cole. And with 3 children, you learn to appreciate the quiet hours." She gestured toward the kitchen window. "I hope you don't mind. I found your flour and started biscuits. The stove took some figuring out, but I managed." Ethan climbed the porch steps and caught the scent of baking bread drifting through the open door. His kitchen, his always empty, always silent kitchen, smelled like someone's home. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to." Clara met his eyes with that same directness he'd noticed yesterday. "You're providing a shelter, Mr. Cole. The least I can do is provide a decent breakfast." There was something in her voice, not quite defiance, but close. A woman establishing her terms, making clear she wouldn't be reduced to helpless charity case. Ethan recognized the impulse because he'd felt it himself, years ago, when neighbors had offered pity disguised as kindness. "Well then," he said, removing his hat, "I appreciate it." They stood there for a moment, an awkward pause stretching between them. Clara seemed about to say something else when a crash from inside the house made them both turn. "I'm fine," Noah's voice called out, slightly panicked. "I just knocked over the— Samuel, help me pick this up before—" Clara was through the door before the boy finished speaking, Ethan following close behind. They found Noah surrounded by scattered tin cups, Samuel already on his knees gathering them, and Lily standing in the bedroom doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "I was trying to set the table," Noah explained, his face flushed, "but I couldn't reach the shelf, and—" "It's all right, sweetheart." Clara knelt beside her sons, helping gather the cups. "No harm done." Ethan watched the 3 of them work together, the boys' movements synchronized with their mothers', everyone knowing their role. Even Lily toddled over to retrieve a cup that had rolled near her feet, carrying it carefully to the table like it was made of glass rather than battered tin. "You're all up early," he observed. "We're early risers," Samuel said, his tone making it sound like a point of pride. "We don't believe in laziness." "Samuel," Clara's voice carried a warning. "Mr. Cole wasn't suggesting— I know, Mama, I just meant—" The boy's face reddened. "I just wanted him to know we're not the kind who sleep half the day away." Ethan studied the boy, that rigid spine, those defensive eyes. Samuel was carrying something heavy, some burden that had nothing to do with tin cups or morning chores, the weight of being the man of the family, probably. The weight of whatever had happened before they'd arrived on his platform yesterday. "I can see that," Ethan said carefully. "Fact is, I could use some help with morning chores if you're interested. Both of you," he added, including Noah, who brightened immediately. "Really?" Noah's enthusiasm was unguarded, childlike in a way his brother's never was. "We can help with the horses. If your mother approves." Three sets of eyes turned to Clara. She'd risen to her feet, wiping her hands on her apron, and Ethan saw the calculation in her expression, weighing risks, measuring trust. "They'll do what you tell them," she said finally. "And if they give you any trouble—" "They won't," Samuel interrupted, his jaw set with determination. "Then, yes." Clara's expression softened slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Cole. They've been cooped up on trains for too long. Some fresh air and honest work will do them good." The boys were already heading for the door when Ethan stopped them. "After breakfast, and you'll need better boots if you're going to be mucking stalls. What you're wearing won't last a day." Samuel's face tightened, that flash of pride again, the kind that came from having too little and trying to hide it. "I've got some old ones in the barn," Ethan continued, as if he hadn't noticed the boy's reaction. "Probably too big, but we can stuff them with newspaper until we get to town for proper fitting." "We can't accept—" Samuel began. "You can and you will," Ethan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Can't have you working in shoes that'll fall apart. That's just common sense, not charity." The distinction mattered. Ethan could see it in the way Samuel's shoulders lowered slightly, the way the fight went out of his posture. Common sense was acceptable. Pity was not. They ate breakfast together, the morning light streaming through windows that Ethan had never bothered to curtain. Clara's biscuits were perfect, fluffy and golden, better than anything he'd managed in years of bachelor cooking. The boys ate like they were afraid the food might disappear, quick and efficient, while Lily picked at her portion with delicate precision, her rag doll seated beside her plate. "Your doll have a name?" Ethan asked the little girl, who'd been watching him with solemn eyes throughout the meal. Lily looked to her mother for permission before answering. "Annabelle." "That's a fine name. She lost her arm on the train." Lily's voice was matter-of-fact, but her hand moved protectively to the doll. "A man stepped on her." "That's unfortunate." Ethan considered this. "I'm not much for sewing, but I bet your mama could fix her up if we found the right materials." "Maybe," Clara said softly, stroking her daughter's hair. "We'll see what we can do." After breakfast, Ethan led the boys outside while Clara stayed behind with Lily, promising to tackle the washing up. The morning was cool, the grass still wet with dew, and the horses in the corral nickered softly as they approached. "First rule of ranch work," Ethan said, leading them toward the barn. "You take care of the animals before you take care of yourself. They depend on you completely, and that's a responsibility you don't take lightly." "Yes, sir," both boys chorused. Inside the barn, Ethan found the old boots he'd mentioned, relics from when he'd been younger and still growing. They were indeed too large for the boys, but serviceable once stuffed with newspaper. While Samuel and Noah changed their footwear, Ethan outlined the morning's tasks. "We'll start with feeding and watering, then mucking the stalls. That's cleaning out the soiled hay and replacing it with fresh. After that, if there's time, we'll check the fence line in the near pasture. Some of the posts need reinforcing before winter." "We can do all that," Samuel said immediately. "I'm sure you can, but we'll take it slow today. No rush." They worked steadily through the morning, and Ethan found himself impressed despite his initial reservations. Samuel approached each task with grim determination, as if proving himself in some invisible competition. Noah was less intense, but more curious, asking questions about every tool, every technique, genuinely interested in learning rather than just completing the work. "Why do you clean the stalls every day?" Noah asked as they forked soiled hay into a wheelbarrow. "Couldn't you do it every few days?" "Could," Ethan agreed, "but daily cleaning keeps the horses healthier, prevents hoof problems, keeps the barn from smelling like a privy, makes the animals more comfortable. You want an animal to work for you, you treat it right." "Papa said animals were just property," Samuel interjected, his voice tight. "He said getting sentimental about them was foolish." "Your papa was entitled to his opinion," Ethan said carefully. "But I found that animals give back what you put in. You treat them like machinery, they'll work like broken machinery. You treat them with respect, they'll work their hearts out for you." Samuel didn't respond, but Ethan saw him processing this, filing it away somewhere. They were finishing the last stall when Miguel arrived, raising an eyebrow at the sight of the boys working alongside Ethan. "You've got helpers today, patron." Miguel, this is Samuel and Noah. Boys, this is Miguel Reyes, best hand in 3 counties, even if he won't admit it. Miguel's weathered face creased into a smile. The boss exaggerates, but I try. He switched to Spanish, speaking to Ethan. These are the family you brought yesterday? Part of them. Their mother and sister are up at the house. Ah. Miguel's expression turned knowing. And how long are they staying? Don't know yet. I see. The hand's tone suggested he saw quite a bit more than Ethan was saying. Well, it's good. A house should have people in it, and you... He switched back to English, addressing the boys. You work hard for Senor Cole, yes? He's a good man, even if he forgets to smile sometimes. Samuel's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. Noah grinned outright. They spent the rest of the morning on the fence line, and it was there that Ethan began to see past Samuel's rigid exterior. The boy had clever hands, quick to learn and steady in execution. When Ethan showed him how to splice wire, Samuel mastered it on the second try. And despite his serious demeanor, he was protective of Noah in small ways, steering his brother away from loose rocks, taking the heavier tools himself, correcting Noah's grip on the post hole digger before Ethan had to say anything. You've done this kind of work before, Ethan observed as they paused for water. Some. Samuel wiped sweat from his forehead. Papa had ideas about farms sometimes. Ventures, he called them. They never lasted long, but we learned things. There was that word again, ventures. And the way Samuel said it, with barely concealed bitterness, suggested those ventures had cost the family more than money. Well, you've got a knack for it, Ethan said. That counts for something. The boy looked surprised, then pleased, before his expression closed off again, as if allowing himself to feel pride was dangerous. They returned to the house near noon to find Clara had been equally busy. The main room had been transformed, swept and dusted, windows washed until they gleamed, the table properly set with plates Ethan had forgotten he owned. She'd even found his mother's old curtains, stored in a trunk, and had hung them in the windows, softening the harsh light. Mrs. Rowan, Ethan said, stopping in the doorway. You didn't have to. I wanted to keep busy. She turned from the stove where something was simmering. I hope you don't mind. I found vegetables in your cellar and made a stew. Nothing fancy, but it should be filling. Mind? The house looked more like a home than it had in 13 years, but admitting that felt like admitting too much, so Ethan just nodded. Smells good. Over the midday meal, a pattern began to emerge. Clara asked about the morning's work, and the boys, even Samuel, animated as they described the horses, the fence mending, Miguel's friendly teasing. Lily contributed observations about a butterfly she'd seen and how her mother had found thread to begin repairing Annabelle's arm. And Ethan, who hadn't shared a meal with another person in longer than he cared to remember, found himself answering questions about the ranch, about Texas, about things he normally kept locked away. How long have you lived here? Clara asked as they cleared the dishes. 13 years on this land, built the house 10 years back. By yourself? Mostly. Had help with the heavy timber, but the rest I did alone. Clara paused in her washing, looking around the room with new appreciation. It's well made, sturdy. It needs to be. Weather out here doesn't forgive poor construction. No, Clara said quietly. I imagine it doesn't forgive much at all. That afternoon, while the boys rested in the shade, Ethan having insisted they not overdo it their first day, he found Clara on the porch, mending what looked like Samuel's shirt. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, the needle flashing in the sunlight. You don't have to do that out here, Ethan said, leaning against the porch rail. There's better light inside. I like being outside. We lived in the city for years, Philadelphia, and before that Baltimore. Always buildings and smoke and noise. This, she gestured toward the open prairie. This is different. Different good or different bad? Different honest. Clara knotted her thread and bit it off. The city lets you pretend things are fine when they're not. Out here, I imagine there's no room for pretending. No, Ethan agreed. There's not. Clara set aside the mending and looked at him directly. I should tell you about Thomas. About why we're here. You don't owe me. I do, though. Her voice was firm. You've opened your home to us, and you deserve to know what kind of people you're sheltering. Ethan settled against the rail, waiting. Clara took a breath, her hands folding in her lap. Thomas was a dreamer, she began. When I married him, I thought it was wonderful. All those plans, all that enthusiasm. He was going to build an empire, he said. Make us rich. Give the children everything. She paused. What I didn't understand was that dreamers sometimes can't tell the difference between dreams and lies. The afternoon was quiet except for the wind moving through the grass, and Clara's voice was steady as she continued. There were investments that weren't real, business partners who were con men, schemes that sounded brilliant but fell apart the moment actual work was required. Thomas would come home excited about some new venture, and I'd want to believe him. The children wanted to believe him. But belief doesn't pay creditors, Mr. Cole. It doesn't put food on the table or keep the rent paid. How did he die? Ethan asked quietly. A fight. Some men he owed money to, substantial money from a card game he swore he'd win. They found him in an alley 3 blocks from our apartment. Clara's voice didn't waver, but her hands had tightened on the mending. The police said it was quick. I'm not sure if that makes it better or worse. I'm sorry. Don't be. I was angry at him for a long time, angry that he kept chasing dreams while our children went hungry, angry that his pride mattered more than their security. But I'm trying not to be angry at a dead man. It seems pointless. Ethan studied her profile, the way she held herself so carefully composed, and felt a rush of respect. This was a woman who'd been dealt a terrible hand and had chosen to play it without complaint, without making herself pitiable. The lawyer said Thomas had a policy, a small life insurance, enough to pay our debts and buy train tickets west. He said you were family, the only family Thomas had mentioned. I didn't know if you'd help, but I had to try. Clara turned to face him fully. I won't lie to you, Mr. Cole. I'm nearly broke. I have skills. I can cook, clean, sew, keep accounts. I'm educated enough to teach if someone needs a governess. But I have 3 children and no husband, and that makes me unmarriageable and unemployable to most people. What are you asking? Time? A few weeks, maybe a month, to find work, to get the children settled somewhere stable. I'll earn our keep while we're here. I'm not afraid of hard work, but I need time to figure out what comes next, and I can't do that if we're sleeping in some boarding house and spending what little money we have on room and board. Ethan looked out at his land, his carefully controlled domain, and felt the walls he'd built continuing to crack. Letting them stay a few days had been impulse. Agreeing to weeks, maybe a month, that was something else entirely. That was opening his life to disruption, to complication, to all the things he'd spent 13 years avoiding. What about the children? He asked. They've been through a lot. How are they handling it? Clara's expression softened slightly. Lily's too young to fully understand. She knows her father's gone, but death is abstract to her still. Noah is sad but resilient. He bounces back quickly, always has. But Samuel, she paused. Samuel remembers every broken promise, every disappointed hope. He's angry, and that anger has nowhere to go, so it turns inward, makes him hard. He's protective of you and his siblings. Too protective. He's 10 years old, Mr. Cole. He should be learning to read better, playing with other children, not acting like he's responsible for keeping our family afloat. Maybe that's how he survives it, Ethan said, but being responsible, having purpose. Clara looked at him with surprise. You understand that? It wasn't a question, and Ethan found himself nodding. I was 12 when my parents died. Had the same impulse, to be strong, to handle everything, to prove I didn't need anyone. Took me years to realize that strength and isolation aren't the same thing. And did you? Realize it, I mean? Ethan met her eyes. I'm still working on it. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, a recognition of shared experience. They were both survivors, both people who'd learned to protect themselves by building walls. The difference was, Clara had 3 children forcing her to keep trying, to keep reaching out. Ethan had only had himself, and that had been enough reason to stop trying at all. You can stay, he said. A month, maybe longer if needed. We'll figure out the details as we go. Mr. Cole, Ethan, if we're going to be sharing a house, you might as well use my given name. Clara blinked, clearly surprised. That's That would be inappropriate. Why? Because of some city notion of propriety? Ethan shook his head. Out here, Mrs. Rowan, propriety takes a back seat to practicality. You're under my roof, helping run my house. Seems foolish to stand on ceremony. Then you should call me Clara. She said it softly, almost testing the sound of her own name in this new context. Clara, Ethan repeated, and found he liked the way it felt. Simple, direct, honest. The days that followed developed their own rhythm. Mornings began with chores, Ethan working with the boys while Clara managed the house and looked after Lily. The children proved quick learners, Samuel especially, though Noah's enthusiasm often made up for what he lacked in natural skill. Afternoons were for different tasks: mending fences, tending the kitchen garden Clara had discovered and immediately claimed, teaching the boys to ride on Ethan's gentler horses. Evenings were the strangest time, when they all gathered in the main room and the house became something Ethan barely recognized. Clara would sew or read from one of the few books she'd brought, her voice filling the space with stories that held even Samuel's reluctant attention. Lily would play with Annabelle, now repaired with carefully stitched thread. The boys would practice their letters. Clara insisted on daily lessons, or ask Ethan questions about ranching, about Texas, about everything their curious minds could conjure. "Did you ever see a tornado?" Noah asked one evening, his eyes wide. "Once. Stayed in the root cellar for 3 hours while it tore up the landscape. Sounded like a freight train and looked like the end of the world." "Were you scared?" "Terrified," Ethan admitted. "Only a fool isn't scared of a tornado." "Papa said being scared was weak," Samuel muttered, not looking up from his slate. "Your papa was wrong about that," Ethan said flatly. "Fear keeps you alive if you're smart about it. It's ignoring fear that gets you killed." Samuel looked up then, something shifting in his expression. "You think Papa was wrong about things?" "I think everybody's wrong about things. The trick is figuring out which things and learning from it." Clara glanced at him over her sewing, a small smile playing at her lips. Later, after the children were in bed, she lingered in the main room while Ethan banked the fire. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not pretending Thomas was perfect, for being honest with Samuel. He needs to hear that his father was human, flawed, wrong sometimes. He's built Thomas up in his head as either a hero or a villain, and neither is true." "What was he then?" Clara considered this. "A man who wanted more than he could have and couldn't accept the life he had. A man who loved his children but loved his dreams more." She paused. "A man I married too young and mourned too briefly." The honesty of it struck Ethan silent. Most widows he'd known wrapped themselves in grief like armor, made their husband's memory sacred. But Clara seemed determined to see Thomas clearly, even if that clarity was painful. "You'll tell them the truth then, when they're older?" "I'll tell them what they need to know when they need to know it. Right now, they need stability more than truth." Clara met his eyes. "And you're giving them that, more than you probably realize." The words settled over Ethan like a weight. He'd thought of this arrangement as temporary, a brief disruption before his life returned to normal. But watching Clara's children bloom under routine and security, seeing Samuel's shoulders gradually lose some of their rigidity, hearing Lily's laughter become more frequent, he was beginning to understand that some disruptions couldn't be undone. Some changes, once started, had momentum all their own. "They're good kids," he said, because it was easier than examining what he really felt. "They are. And they're learning from you, about work, about integrity, about what it means to be reliable." Clara smiled slightly. "Samuel actually smiled yesterday. A real smile, not that grim thing he usually does. It was while you were showing him how to curry the horses." Ethan remembered the moment. The boy's unexpected delight when Sable had leaned into his brushing, clearly enjoying the attention. For just a few seconds, Samuel had looked like what he was, a 10-year-old child experiencing simple joy. "He's got a gift with animals," Ethan said. "Natural hands." "He gets that from Thomas's father, supposedly. Thomas used to talk about his father's farm, though I suspect half of it was invention." Clara set down her sewing. "I should let you get to sleep. I know mornings come early." But she didn't move, and neither did Ethan. They stood there in the firelight, the house quiet around them, and something unspoken hung in the air between them. "This is strange," Clara said finally, "being here. With you. A month ago, I didn't know you existed. Now you're... what?" "I don't know. Important, somehow. To the children. To our future." She shook her head. "I don't mean to make you uncomfortable. I want you to know I see what you're doing, what you're giving us. And I won't forget it." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. Gratitude made him uncomfortable, especially when he wasn't sure his motives were as pure as she seemed to think. Part of him had invited them to stay out of duty, but another part, a part growing stronger each day, had invited them because the house felt less empty with them in it. Because Clara's presence across the breakfast table made the morning seem less stark. Because hearing children's voices made the silence seem less like peace and more like loneliness. "You're earning your keep," he said gruffly, "more than earning it. The house has never looked better, and those meals you've been cooking..." "I enjoy cooking when there's enough food to work with." Clara's expression turned rueful. "The last year in Philadelphia, we ate a lot of potatoes and not much else." "Well, there's no shortage of food here. You don't need to stretch everything like you're still rationing." "Old habits," Clara said. "Hard to break." They said goodnight then, Clara disappearing into the bedroom where her children slept, Ethan heading to his own room across the house. But as he lay in bed, listening to the small sounds of a house full of people, he found himself thinking about Clara's words. Important. To their future. What future, though? Clara would find work eventually. A woman with her skills and determination wouldn't stay dependent long. She'd take the children and move on, build a new life somewhere, and his house would return to its former emptiness. That was the plan. That was what made sense. So why did the thought of it make his chest tight with something that felt uncomfortably like dread? The question was still with him 3 weeks later when Miguel pulled him aside after morning chores. "Patron, I need to speak with you." They walked to the barn, and Miguel's expression was unusually serious. "There's talk in town," Miguel said, "about you and the señora, about the children." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that happens when a single man takes in a widow and her children. People are assuming things. Let them assume." "Ethan." Miguel rarely used his given name, and the sound of it now carried weight. "I don't care what people think. You know this. But the señora might. And if she's looking for work, for a future here, reputation matters." "She's done nothing wrong. Neither have I." "I know that. You know that. But people talk, and talk becomes truth in their minds." Miguel paused. "I'm just saying, be careful, for her sake." The conversation gnawed at Ethan for the rest of the day. He'd been so focused on the practical aspects of their arrangement, keeping them fed, sheltered, safe, that he hadn't considered how it might look to others. A single man, a widow, living under one roof with no chaperone, no formal arrangement. In the city, it would be scandalous. Even out here, where people were supposedly more practical, it would raise eyebrows. That evening, he found Clara alone on the porch again, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. "Miguel said there's talk in town," Ethan said without preamble. "About us, about the arrangement here." Clara's hand stilled on her mending. "I see. Does that bother you?" "Should it?" She looked at him directly. "We're doing nothing wrong, Ethan. I'm keeping house in exchange for room and board. That's a transaction, not a scandal. In theory. But you said yourself you need to find work, build a reputation. If people are talking, then let them talk." Clara's voice carried an edge he hadn't heard before. "I spent years in Philadelphia worrying about what people thought, trying to maintain appearances while our lives fell apart behind closed doors. I won't do that anymore. If I'm to be judged, let it be for who I am, not for gossip and speculation." Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Respect. Admiration. Maybe something deeper he wasn't ready to name. Clara Rowan refused to be reduced to scandal or pity. She claimed her dignity like it was a birthright, and watching her do it made Ethan feel both protective and humbled. "All right," he said, "but if you change your mind..." "I won't." Clara returned to her mending, then paused. "Unless you're worried about your own reputation?" I stopped caring what people thought of me a long time ago. Good. She smiled slightly. Then we understand each other. They did, Ethan realized. Against all odds, against every logical reason, they understood each other perfectly. Two people who'd built walls for protection, who'd learned to survive on their own terms, who refused to bend to others' expectations. And somehow, impossibly, those walls were beginning to crack, not breaking, but opening just enough to let someone else in. It should have terrified him. Maybe it did. But standing there on the porch with Clara as the sun set over his land, Ethan couldn't quite bring himself to regret it. The change in weather came without warning, the way it often did in Texas. One morning in early October, the air turned sharp and cold, carrying the metallic smell of approaching rain. Ethan stood on the porch, watching dark clouds gather on the horizon, his coffee growing cold in his hand. Storm coming? Clara appeared beside him, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the chill. Looks like. Probably hit by afternoon. Ethan drained his cup. I need to get the cattle moved to the near pasture before it does. And check that the barn roof is secured. Last big storm found some weak spots I thought I'd patched. The boys can help. I'd rather they stay close to the house. Weather like this can turn dangerous fast. Clara nodded, but Ethan saw the flash of concern in her eyes. In the month they'd been here, the children had grown comfortable on the ranch, confident in their routines. Samuel especially had taken to the work with an intensity that sometimes worried Ethan. The boy pushed himself hard, as if trying to prove something no one was asking him to prove. After breakfast, Ethan rode out with Miguel to move the cattle, leaving strict instructions for the boys to stay near the house and help their mother prepare for the storm. By the time they returned 2 hours later, the wind had picked up considerably, and the first fat drops of rain were beginning to fall. That's all of them, Miguel said, wiping rain from his face as they led their horses into the barn. Should ride it out fine in the near pasture. Good. You head home before this gets worse. No sense you getting caught in it. Miguel nodded and mounted up, spurring his horse toward town. Ethan watched him go, then turned to tend to Sable, stripping off her saddle and beginning to rub her down. The rain intensified, drumming on the barn roof in a steady rhythm that would have been soothing if not for the wind beginning to howl around the corners. He was checking the feed stores when he heard voices outside, children's voices raised against the storm. I can do it. I'm strong enough. Samuel, Mama said to wait for Mr. Cole. Ethan rushed to the barn door and found Samuel and Noah struggling with a section of the corral fence that had come loose in the wind. The wood was heavy, waterlogged from the rain, and Samuel was trying to lift it back into place while Noah held what looked like a hammer and nails. Boys! Ethan's voice cut through the storm. What are you doing? The fence came loose, Samuel shouted back, rain streaming down his face. We're fixing it before the horses get out. Get inside the house, both of you. I'll handle the fence. We can help. Samuel, this isn't safe. But the boy wasn't listening. He'd gotten the fence section upright and was trying to hold it steady while Noah fumbled with the hammer. The wind gusted hard, catching the loose wood like a sail, and Samuel's feet slipped in the mud. Everything happened too fast and too slow at once. The fence section twisted, the jagged end of a broken board swinging around. Samuel tried to dodge, but his feet couldn't find purchase in the slick mud. Noah screamed, and then Samuel was falling, the boy's head striking the edge of the water trough with a sickening crack that Ethan heard even over the storm. Ethan was running before Samuel hit the ground, his heart hammering against his ribs. He dropped to his knees beside the boy, rain pelting his back, and his hand shook as he turned Samuel over. The child was unconscious, a gash above his left eyebrow bleeding freely, mixing with the rain that washed across his pale face. His breathing was shallow, rapid, and when Ethan touched his shoulder, there was no response. Noah, run to the house. Get your mother, now! The younger boy stood frozen, his eyes huge with terror. Noah, go! That broke the spell. Noah dropped the hammer and ran, his small form disappearing into the curtain of rain. Ethan gathered Samuel carefully, mindful of possible injuries he couldn't see, and carried him toward the house. The boy felt impossibly light in his arms, fragile in a way that made Ethan's chest constrict with fear. The door burst open before he reached it. Clara stood in the doorway, her face draining of color when she saw her son's limp form. What happened? He hit his head badly, Ethan carried Samuel inside, laying him on the table that Clara had hastily cleared. "Noah, get me clean cloths. Clara, I need water." But Clara was already moving, her hand steady despite the terror in her eyes. She pressed a cloth against Samuel's head wound, her other hand feeling for his pulse at his neck. "His heartbeat is strong," she said, and Ethan heard her trying to convince herself as much as inform him. "That's good. That's good." Lily had appeared from the bedroom, clutching Annabelle, her small face crumpling as she saw her brother. Noah hovered nearby, shaking, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been simple repetition of the word please. "We need the doctor," Clara said, her voice tight. "Ethan, he needs a doctor." "Town's an hour away in good weather. In this storm—" "I don't care about the storm." Clara's composure cracked, her voice rising. "My son is hurt. He needs help." Samuel stirred then, a low moan escaping his lips. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "Mama?" "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here." Clara's hand smoothed his hair back from the wound, her touch infinitely gentle. "Don't move. You hit your head." "The fence." Samuel tried to sit up and immediately went white, his eyes rolling back. "Lie still." Clara's voice was sharp with fear. "Samuel, please lie still." The boy's eyes closed again, and this time he didn't respond when Clara called his name. Her hands trembled as she continued to press the cloth against his wound, blood seeping through despite her efforts. Ethan had seen men injured before. Ranch work was dangerous, accidents inevitable. But those had been grown men, people who'd chosen the risks they took. Samuel was a child, 10 years old, and the sight of him lying pale and still on the table made something primal and terrible rise in Ethan's throat. "I'll ride for the doctor," he heard himself say. "In this?" Clara looked at the windows where rain lashed against the glass. "Ethan, you can't." "I can, and I will." He was already moving toward the door. "Keep pressure on that wound. If he wakes up, don't let him move. I'll be back as fast as I can." "Ethan." He turned back and their eyes met across Samuel's unconscious form. In that moment, something passed between them. An understanding deeper than words, a shared terror that transcended the careful boundaries they'd maintained. "I'll bring the doctor," Ethan said. "I promise." Then he was out the door, into the storm, running for the barn where Sable waited. The mare sensed his urgency, dancing nervously as he threw on her saddle. The storm had intensified, rain falling so hard it was difficult to see more than a few feet ahead, but Ethan didn't hesitate. He mounted and turned Sable toward town, urging her into a gallop that was reckless in the conditions but necessary. The ride became a blur of rain and wind and fear. Sable stumbled twice on the muddy road, nearly throwing Ethan both times, but he kept her moving, kept pushing forward. His mind couldn't settle on anything except the image of Samuel's pale face, the blood that had been too bright against his skin, the terrible stillness of his small body. When had it happened? When had these children stopped being strangers and become something more? When had their safety become more important than his own? Ethan couldn't pinpoint the moment, but somewhere in the past month, Claire's family had worked their way past his defenses, had planted themselves in the hollow spaces of his carefully empty life. And now one of them might die. The thought was unbearable. Ethan leaned forward in the saddle, rain streaming down his face, and pushed Sable harder. Town appeared through the storm like a miracle. Ethan rode straight to Doc Harrison's house, barely dismounting before pounding on the door. The doctor, a grizzled man in his 60s who'd seen everything the frontier could offer, took one look at Ethan's face and reached for his bag. "What is it?" "Boy, 10 years old, head injury, unconscious." Ethan's words came in gasps. "You need to come now." "In this storm?" "Now, Doc." Something in Ethan's voice must have convinced him. Harrison grabbed his coat and a second bag, then followed Ethan to where Sable stood heaving. The doctor had his own horse saddled within minutes, and then they were riding back into the storm, back toward the ranch where Clara waited with her children. The return journey felt longer than the trip out. Every minute stretched like hours, and Ethan found himself making bargains with a universe he'd long since stopped believing cared. Let the boy live, and I'll do anything. Let him wake up, let him be all right, and I'll never ask for anything else. When they finally reached the ranch, Ethan burst through the door to find the scene exactly as he'd left it, frozen like a terrible painting. Samuel still lay on the table. Clara still pressed cloth to his wound, though the bleeding had slowed. Lily sat in the corner with Annabelle, silent tears streaming down her face. Noah stood beside his mother, holding her elbow as if his touch could transfer strength. Doc Harrison didn't waste time with questions. He moved to the table, his practiced hands beginning to examine Samuel with efficient care. Clara stepped back reluctantly, her dress stained with her son's blood, her face a mask of barely controlled terror. Ethan moved to her side and, without thinking, took her hand. She gripped it hard enough to hurt, but he didn't pull away. They stood together, watching the doctor work, and Ethan felt the tremors running through her body. "The wound itself isn't deep," Harrison said after what felt like an eternity. "Head wounds bleed like the devil, but this one's already clotting. What worries me is the unconsciousness. He took a hard blow." "Will he wake up?" Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. "Can't say for certain. Brain injuries are tricky things. He might wake up in an hour perfectly fine, or—" The doctor trailed off, and the unspoken possibilities hung in the air like smoke. "Or what?" Clara demanded. "Tell me." Harrison looked at her with sympathy. "Or there could be swelling, bleeding inside the skull. In which case—" He paused. "I've seen men die from less severe blows, Mrs. Rowan, and I've seen men walk away from worse. There's no predicting it. So we wait. We wait. Keep him still, keep him warm. Watch for signs of waking. If he starts vomiting or seizing, call for me immediately." The doctor cleaned and bandaged the wound with neat, practiced movements, then helped move Samuel to the bedroom where he could lie more comfortably. Clara refused to leave her son's side, settling into a chair beside the bed while Lily climbed up to curl against her mother's side. Ethan stood in the doorway, feeling useless and terrified in equal measure. Behind him, Noah tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Cole? Is Samuel going to die?" The boy's face was streaked with tears and rain, his eyes pleading for reassurance Ethan couldn't give. He wanted to lie, to offer empty comfort, but Noah deserved honesty. "I don't know, son. The doctor's doing everything he can." "It's my fault." Noah's voice broke. "I told him we should wait for you, but he wouldn't listen, and then the fence—" "Hey." Ethan knelt down, putting his hands on the boy's shoulders. "This is not your fault. Accidents happen. Samuel was trying to help, and sometimes trying to help goes wrong, but that doesn't make it your fault. But if I'd been stronger, if I could have held the fence— You're 7 years old, Noah. That fence was too heavy for a grown man in that wind. You couldn't have held it no matter how strong you were." The boy dissolved into sobs, and Ethan pulled him close, letting him cry against his shoulder. Over Noah's head, he saw Clara watching from the bedroom, her expression so full of pain and gratitude and fear that it made his chest ache. Doc Harrison stayed through the night, dozing in a chair by the fire while Ethan kept watch from the porch, unable to settle, unable to stop moving. The storm raged on, wind howling like something alive and angry, rain coming in sheets that made the world beyond the porch invisible. Somewhere near midnight, Clara emerged from the bedroom, moving like a woman in a dream. Ethan met her at the door, steadying her when she swayed slightly. "Any change?" "No. He just lies there." Her voice was hollow. "So still. I keep checking to make sure he's breathing. Doc says that's normal, the body's way of healing." "The body's way of dying, you mean?" Clara's laugh was bitter, broken. "I've seen death, Ethan. I watched it take my husband. This looks the same." "It's not the same. Samuel's strong. He'll fight through this." "You don't know that. You can't promise that." She looked up at him, and in the lamplight her eyes were devastated. "What if I lose him? What if I brought my children all this way, to this place I thought would be safe, and I lose him anyway?" Ethan didn't have an answer. He'd spent 13 years avoiding exactly this kind of pain, this vulnerability that came from caring about someone who could be taken away. And now here he was, drowning in it, feeling Clara's anguish like it was his own. "Come here," he said, and pulled her into his arms. Clara stiffened for just a moment before collapsing against him, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering. She cried against his chest, harsh sobs that shook her whole body, and Ethan held her through it, his hand moving in slow circles on her back. "I can't lose him," she whispered between sobs. "I can't. He's my son. My boy. I've already lost so much, I can't." "You won't." Ethan heard himself making promises he had no right to make. He's going to be fine. He has to be. They stood there in the doorway, the storm raging outside and terror raging within, holding on to each other like drowning people clutching wreckage. And somewhere in that moment, something fundamental shifted in Ethan's carefully guarded heart. He loved them, all of them. Clara with her fierce pride and hidden softness. Samuel with his rigid determination. Noah with his eager curiosity. Even little Lily with her solemn eyes and precious doll. They'd worked their way into his life like water seeping through cracks, and now they were part of the foundation itself. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like waking up from a long sleep, painful and disorienting, but ultimately necessary. "I'm here," he said into Clara's hair. "I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens, I'm here." She didn't answer, just held him tighter, and they stayed that way until Noah called from the bedroom, his voice high with excitement and fear. "Mama, Mama, he moved. Samuel moved his hand." Clara broke away and ran to the bedroom, Ethan right behind her. Doc Harrison was already there, bent over Samuel, and the boy's eyes were open, confused and unfocused, but undeniably open. "Samuel?" Clara dropped to her knees beside the bed, taking her son's hand. "Can you hear me?" "Mama." The word was slurred but recognizable. "My head hurts." "I know, sweetheart. You hit it, but you're going to be all right." Harrison was checking Samuel's pupils, asking him simple questions, his name, where he was, what he remembered. Samuel answered slowly, his words careful, as if speaking required great effort, but he answered. And with each response, the terrible tension in the room began to ease. "He's through the worst of it," Harrison said finally, sitting back with visible relief. "The fact that he's awake and responsive is excellent. He'll need rest, lots of it, and watching for the next few days. But I'd say the boy's got a hard head." Clara laughed, the sound edged with hysteria and relief. "He gets that from his father." Ethan sagged against the doorframe, the adrenaline that had carried him through the past hours suddenly draining away. His legs felt weak, his hands trembled, and when Clara looked over at him, he saw his own exhaustion mirrored in her face. "Thank you," she mouthed silently. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and stepped back to give her space with her son. But as he turned away, Samuel's voice stopped him. "Mr. Cole?" Ethan moved to the bedside. "Yeah, son?" "I'm sorry. About the fence. I just wanted to help." "I know you did, and it's all right. The fence doesn't matter." "But I disobeyed. You said to stay at the house, and I didn't listen." Samuel's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I messed up." Ethan looked at this boy who carried too much responsibility, who pushed himself too hard trying to be the man his family needed, and felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You did mess up," he said honestly, "but you did it trying to help, trying to be useful. That counts for something. Just next time maybe listen when someone tells you something's too dangerous, all right?" "Yes, sir." Samuel's eyes were already drifting closed again, exhaustion reclaiming him. "Sleep now. Everything else can wait." The storm broke just before dawn, the clouds parting to reveal a sky full of stars. Ethan stood on the porch watching the first light touch the horizon, turning the wet prairie into something that sparkled like it had been washed clean. Doc Harrison had left an hour ago, satisfied that Samuel was stable and recovering. The boy had woken twice more during the night, each time more alert and oriented than the last. By morning, he was complaining about being made to stay in bed, a sure sign, Harrison said, that he was on the mend. The bedroom door opened and Clara stepped out, her hair loose around her shoulders, dark circles under her eyes, but her expression lighter than it had been in hours. "He's asleep again," she said, joining Ethan on the porch. "Really asleep this time, not unconscious. I can tell the difference." "That's good." "Lily and Noah are with him. They wouldn't leave his side." Clara wrapped her arms around herself against the morning chill. "I thought I'd lost him, Ethan. For hours I was certain I'd lost him." "But you didn't." "No." She was quiet for a moment. You rode through that storm. You could have been killed. Wasn't going to let him die because I was too scared to ride in some rain. Clara turned to face him fully, and in the growing light, he could see every emotion playing across her face: gratitude, wonder, something deeper that made his pulse quicken. You care about him. About them. About us. It wasn't a question, but Ethan answered anyway. Yes. When did that happen? I don't know. Somewhere between arriving at the train station and right now. Might have been gradual. Might have been all at once. Does it matter? It matters to me. Clara stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. Because I care about you too, and that terrifies me. Why? Because caring means vulnerability. It means trusting someone not to leave, not to fail, not to break the promises they make. And I'm not sure I know how to do that anymore. Ethan understood exactly what she meant. He'd built his entire adult life around not trusting, not depending, not allowing himself to care enough to be hurt. But standing there with Clara, having just spent a night facing the possibility of losing Samuel, he realized that the walls he'd built hadn't protected him from pain. They'd just made him lonely. I can't promise I won't fail, he said carefully. I can't promise everything will work out the way we want, but I can promise I'll try. And I can promise I'm not going anywhere. Even though we've turned your quiet life upside down? Especially because of that. Ethan reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, marveling at his own daring. Turns out my quiet life was just empty. I didn't know the difference until you showed up. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. We're a mess, Ethan. Me and my children. We're complicated and damaged, and we come with so much baggage. So do I. Not like this. Probably worse than this. I've spent 13 years hiding from the world, Clara. At least you kept trying. At least you kept reaching out for something better. She laughed softly. Is that what I was doing? It felt more like drowning and grabbing at anything that might float. Same thing sometimes. They stood there as the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and Ethan felt something that had been frozen in his chest for years begin to thaw. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely unexpected, this feeling of connection, of belonging to something larger than himself. What happens now? Clara asked quietly. I don't know. But whatever it is, we figure it out together. Together, Clara repeated, testing the word. I like the sound of that. From inside the house came the sound of children's voices. Noah saying something that made Samuel laugh weakly. Lily's high voice joining in. The sound of a family, messy and imperfect and beautifully alive. Ethan had spent 13 years convinced that survival meant solitude, that strength meant isolation. But watching the sunrise with Clara beside him, listening to her children laugh inside his house, he understood that he'd been wrong about everything. The frontier demanded toughness, yes, but it also demanded community, connection, the courage to build something worth protecting. And what he was building here with Clara, with her children, with this ragtag family that had stumbled into his life, that was worth protecting. That was worth everything. Come on, he said, taking Clara's hand. Let's go check on our patient. Our patient, Clara echoed, her fingers tightening around his. I like that too. They walked inside together, and for the first time in longer than Ethan could remember, his house felt exactly like what it was supposed to be. It felt like home. Samuel's recovery became a slow unfolding, days measured in small victories that felt monumental. The first time he sat up without dizziness. The first meal he ate without nausea. The first afternoon he spent reading on the porch instead of confined to bed. Each milestone was celebrated quietly, gratefully, by a family that had tasted how fragile life could be. But the accident had changed more than just Samuel's health. It had shifted something fundamental in the dynamics of the household, cracking open doors that had been carefully held shut. Ethan found himself drawn into the bedroom more frequently during those first days of recovery, sitting in the chair beside Samuel's bed while Clara tended to other tasks. He'd bring books from his small collection, reading aloud when the boy was too weak to focus on the pages himself. Stories of adventure and exploration, tales of men who'd faced impossible odds and prevailed. Do you think I'll be able to ride again? Samuel asked one afternoon, his voice still carrying the faint slur that Doc Harrison promised would fade with time. I know you will. Just need to give your head time to heal properly. I'm afraid I'll fall off, that I'll get hurt again. The admission came quietly, shamefully, as if fear were a weakness Samuel couldn't afford. Ethan set down the book he'd been reading and looked at the boy directly. Being afraid after you've been hurt isn't weakness, Samuel. It's your body trying to protect you. The trick is learning when to listen to that fear and when to push past it. How do you know the difference? You don't, always. Sometimes you just have to trust your gut and hope for the best. Ethan paused. But I'll tell you this. When you're ready to ride again, I'll be right there beside you, and if you fall, I'll help you get back up. That's what people do for each other. Samuel's eyes glistened with something that might have been tears, quickly blinked away. My father used to say, depending on people made you weak, that a man had to stand on his own. Your father was wrong about a lot of things, Ethan said gently, and I say that with respect because I used to believe the same thing. Spent 13 years proving I didn't need anyone. You know what that got me? What? A clean house, a successful ranch, and absolutely nobody to share it with. Ethan leaned forward. Strength isn't about standing alone, Samuel. It's about knowing when to accept help and when to offer it. It's about building something with people you trust instead of building walls to keep them out. The boy absorbed this in silence, his young face serious with concentration. Finally, he said, I'm glad we came here. I'm glad we found you. The simple honesty of it struck Ethan somewhere deep in his chest. I'm glad too, son. When he left the bedroom an hour later, he found Clara in the kitchen kneading bread dough with methodical intensity. She looked up as he entered, flour dusting her hands and a strand of hair falling loose from its pins. How is he? Good. Asking questions, worrying about writing again. Doc says those are healthy signs. He talks to you differently than he talks to me. Clara's voice held no accusation, just observation. More openly, as if you understand something I don't. I understand what it's like to be a boy trying to be a man before you're ready. Your boys need their mother, don't doubt that. But sometimes they need someone who's walked the path ahead of them too. Clara nodded slowly, her hands stilling in the dough. Thomas never talked to them like that. He was either absent or making promises he couldn't keep. There was no middle ground, no steady presence. She looked at Ethan directly. You're giving them something they've never had. Stability. Reliability. A man whose word actually means something. Don't diminish it, Clara interrupted. Please, let me be grateful without you deflecting. So Ethan stood there, uncomfortable with praise but learning to accept it, while Clara shaped her dough and the afternoon light slanted through the windows. Outside he could hear Noah and Lily playing some game that involved a great deal of running and laughing, their voices bright with the resilience of children. There's something else I need to tell you, Clara said, not looking up from her work. I've been thinking about what comes next. For us. Ethan's stomach tightened. This was the conversation he'd been dreading, the one where Clara announced she'd found work elsewhere, that it was time to move on, that their stay had always been temporary. I wrote to some families in town, Clara continued, asking about positions as a governess or housekeeper. I thought that's what we needed. Independence. Our own place. A way to stop imposing on your generosity. You're not imposing. Let me finish. Clara finally looked at him, her eyes steady. I wrote those letters 3 weeks ago, before Samuel's accident, and yesterday I received 2 responses, both offering positions. One family needs a governess for their 3 daughters. The other needs a housekeeper and cook for a widower with a young son. The words landed like stones. Ethan forced himself to remain still, to keep his expression neutral, even as something twisted painfully in his chest. That's good, he managed. That's what you wanted. It's what I thought I wanted, Clara corrected. But then Samuel nearly died, and I watched you ride through that storm without hesitation. I watched you stay up all night, watched you care for my children like they were your own. And I realized something. What? That I've been so focused on being independent, on not needing anyone, that I almost missed what was right in front of me. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and came around the table to stand directly before him. You said we'd figure things out together. Did you mean that? Yes. Then I need to know what you want, Ethan. Not what you think I want to hear, not what's proper or expected. What do you actually want? The question hung between them, enormous and terrifying. Ethan had spent so many years not wanting anything beyond the next day's work, the next season's harvest. Wanting implied hope, and hope invited disappointment. But standing here with Clara looking at him so directly, he couldn't hide behind old fears anymore. I want you to stay, he said, his voice rough. You and the children, not as guests, not as temporary arrangement. I want you to stay permanently. As what? Your housekeeper? As my wife. The words came out before he could second-guess them, stark and honest in the quiet kitchen. Clara's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. Ethan, I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other 6 weeks, but I also know that in those 6 weeks, you've changed everything about my life. This house was just a building before you arrived. Now it's a home. I was just surviving before. Now I'm living. He took a breath. I'm not asking because I pity you or because I think you need saving. I'm asking because I love you, all of you, and I want to build a future together. Clara stood very still, her eyes searching his face. When she spoke, her voice trembled slightly. Do you understand what you're taking on? 3 children who aren't yours. A woman with almost nothing to her name. The talk that will follow, people saying I trapped you, that you married me out of obligation. I don't care what people say. The children's grief, their complications, Samuel's stubbornness and Noah's nightmares, and Lily's attachment issues. I want all of it, Ethan interrupted. The complications, the chaos, the noise. I want morning arguments about chores and evening stories by the fire. I want to teach Samuel to be a better man than his father. I want to watch Noah's curiosity bloom. I want to see Lily grow up feeling safe and loved. He paused. And I want to wake up every morning next to you, knowing we're building something that matters. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, but she was smiling. I don't love you yet. I care about you deeply, but love, real love, that takes time. I know. But I think I could love you. I think I'm already halfway there. Clara reached up, touching his face with her flour-dusted hand. And my children already adore you, which counts for more than you probably realize. Is that a yes? That's a yes, but with conditions. Clara's expression turned serious. I won't be a burden. I'll contribute equally to this household, to this partnership, and I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll never make promises you can't keep, that you'll be honest with me, even when it's hard, that if you're struggling or uncertain, you'll tell me instead of hiding behind stoic silence. Her voice softened. I lived with secrets and false assurances for too long. I need truth, even if it's uncomfortable. I promise, Ethan said. On everything I hold sacred, I promise. Clara pulled him down and kissed him, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as he wrapped his arms around her waist. She tasted like flour and hope, and when they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. We should tell the children, Clara said. Together. They found all 3 in the bedroom, where Samuel still spent most of his time. The boy was sitting up in bed, looking stronger than he had in days, while Noah showed him something he'd drawn and Lily attempted to braid her doll's yarn hair. The children looked up as their mother and Ethan entered, and something in their expressions suggested they sensed this was important. We need to talk to you about something, Clara began, settling on the edge of Samuel's bed. Ethan stood beside her, his hand finding hers. Are we leaving? Samuel's voice was tight with barely controlled fear. Did we do something wrong? No, sweetheart, nothing like that. Clara squeezed Ethan's hand. Actually, we wanted to ask how you'd feel about staying here. Permanently. 3 pairs of eyes widened. Noah spoke first. Really? We can stay forever. If you want to, Ethan said. Your mother and I, we've been talking, and we think this could be a real home for all of us, together. Like a family? Lily's small voice was hopeful. Exactly like a family, Clara confirmed. Ethan has asked me to marry him, and I've said yes. But this decision affects all of you, so we wanted to make sure you understood what it means. Samuel's face had gone carefully blank, That protective mask Ethan had come to recognize. You're marrying him because you need his money, because we need a place to live. Samuel! Clara's voice was sharp, but Ethan held up a hand. It's a fair question. He moved to sit in the chair beside the bed, putting himself at eye level with the boy. You're right that your mother needs stability. You all do. And yes, marrying me gives you that. A home, security, a future. But that's not why she's saying yes. Then why? Because in the past 6 weeks, we've become important to each other. Because we work well together. Because I love her, and I love you children, and I want to be part of this family. Ethan held Samuel's suspicious gaze. I'm not trying to replace your father. I can't do that, and I won't try. But I can be someone you count on, someone who's here, day after day, keeping his promises. Papa made promises too, Samuel said bitterly. They didn't mean anything. I know, and I can't prove to you that I'm different just by talking. I have to show you, over time, through action. Ethan leaned forward. But I'm willing to try if you're willing to give me a chance. The room was silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Samuel's jaw worked, his eyes bright with emotions Ethan couldn't fully read. Finally, the boy looked at his mother. Do you love him, Mama? Really? Clara's answer came without hesitation. I'm learning to, and I trust him, Samuel. More than I've trusted anyone in a long time. That has to count for something. Samuel turned his attention back to Ethan. If we say yes, what changes? Everything and nothing, Ethan said honestly. You'll have a father again, or at least someone filling that role. You'll have responsibilities on this ranch, real work that matters. You'll have stability and security. But you'll also have expectations. I'll expect you to follow through on commitments, to treat your mother and siblings with respect, to work hard and honest. I already do those things. I know you do, and that won't change. Ethan paused. What will change is that you won't have to do them alone anymore. You won't have to be the man of the family at 10 years old. You can just be a boy who's learning and growing with adults around to shoulder the weight. Something in Samuel's expression cracked, just slightly. And if I make mistakes? Then we'll work through them together. That's what families do. Noah had been listening with rapt attention, but now he burst out, I think it's wonderful. Can I call you Papa? The question caught Ethan off guard. He looked at Clara, who nodded slightly, leaving the decision to him. If you want to, Ethan said carefully, though you might want to take some time to think about it. That's a big word, and it comes with meaning. I want to, Noah insisted. You're already more like a papa than Papa was. You actually teach us things and spend time with us, and Noah, Samuel cut him off, his voice tight. Don't. But it's true. Papa was always gone or drunk or angry about money. Mr. Cole, Ethan, he's here. He cares about us. That doesn't mean we forget Papa existed. I'm not saying forget. I'm saying, boys. Claire's voice was firm. Both of you stop. She looked at Samuel with gentle understanding. Your brother isn't betraying your father's memory by accepting Ethan into his life. And you're not betraying anything by being cautious. You both get to feel however you feel. Samuel's eyes were wet now, and when he spoke, his voice broke. What if it doesn't work? What if he leaves like Papa did? What if we trust him and he... Hey! Ethan moved to sit on the bed, close enough that Samuel could push him away if he wanted. I can't promise I'll never make mistakes. I can't promise life won't throw hard things at us. But I can promise I won't leave. I won't abandon you. That's not who I am. You don't know that. People always leave eventually. Not always. Ethan thought of his own losses, his own fears. Sometimes people stay. Sometimes they choose to stay even when it's hard, even when it would be easier to walk away. I'm choosing to stay, Samuel. For your mother, for you, for your brother and sister. That's my choice, and I'm making it freely. The boy stared at him for a long moment, and Ethan could see the war happening behind those young eyes, the desperate want to believe warring with the learned certainty that trust led to pain. Finally, so quietly Ethan almost didn't hear it, Samuel said, Okay. Okay? Okay, you can marry Mama. Okay, we can stay. Samuel wiped roughly at his eyes. But I'm watching you. If you hurt her, if you hurt any of us, then you'll have every right to call me out on it. Ethan finished. Fair enough? Lily had been watching this entire exchange with her solemn eyes, and now she climbed onto the bed beside Samuel, tucking herself against Ethan's side. Will you read to us every night? She asked. Like a real papa? Ethan's throat tightened with emotion. Every night I'm home, I promise. And help Mama with cooking? As much as she'll let me. And fix Annabelle if she breaks again? Absolutely. Lily considered this, then nodded decisively. Okay then, you can be our papa. The simplicity of childhood acceptance, the way Lily could weigh evidence and make decisions without the complications of adult fear, it made Ethan smile even as his eyes burned with unshed tears. Claire was watching all of this with an expression of wonder and gratitude, and when their eyes met across her children, Ethan saw his own emotions reflected back at him. This family, these people who'd stumbled into his life 6 weeks ago, they were his now, and he was theirs. The next week passed in a blur of preparation. Clara wrote polite refusals to both families who'd offered her positions, and the relief in her voice as she sealed those letters told Ethan he'd made the right choice. They rode into town together to speak with the minister about a wedding, enduring the curious stares and whispered conversations that followed them through the streets. Let them talk, Clara said as they left the church, her hand secure in the crook of Ethan's arm. We know the truth. That's enough. But not everyone was content with whispers. 3 days before the planned wedding, a visitor arrived at the ranch, a man Ethan recognized from town, James Thornton, whose ranch bordered his property to the north. Thornton was in his 40s, prosperous and widowed, with a reputation for shrewd business dealings. Cole, Thornton called from horseback, tipping his hat as Ethan emerged from the barn. Got a moment? What can I do for you, Thornton? The man dismounted, his eyes already scanning the ranch yard where Noah and Lily were playing. Heard interesting news in town. You're taking a wife. That's right. The widow Rowan, the one who showed up with nothing but 3 hungry children. Thornton's tone was conversational, but Ethan heard the edge beneath it. She showed up with more than that. But yes, that's who I'm marrying. Interesting timing, don't you think? Woman arrives destitute. Within weeks she's convinced you to marry her. Thornton smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Some might say that's rather calculated. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. Is there a point to this visit, Thornton? Just looking out for a fellow rancher. I actually met Mrs. Rowan in town last week. Lovely woman, quite charming. I offered her a position, housekeeper and companion. Very generous terms. He paused. She turned me down, said she had other arrangements. She did, with me. So I gathered. Thornton's expression turned speculative. I'll be direct, Cole. I've been looking for a suitable wife for some time. Mrs. Rowan fits my requirements perfectly. Educated, refined, already proven herself capable with children. My boy needs a mother, and she needs security. It's a practical arrangement. She's marrying me. Are you sure about that? Or did you just happen to be convenient? Thornton stepped closer. Think about it, Cole. You've been alone for years. Suddenly, a pretty widow shows up on your doorstep with a sad story. Don't you wonder if maybe you're being played? Before Ethan could respond, Clara's voice cut through the tension. Mr. Thornton, what an unexpected visit. She'd emerged from the house, and she approached them with her head high and her expression cool. Thornton tipped his hat, his smile widening. Mrs. Rowan, I was just discussing with Cole here my offer of employment. The position is still open if you've reconsidered. I haven't, and I find it remarkably presumptuous that you'd come to my fiancé's home to poach his future wife. Poach is a strong word. I'm simply ensuring you understand all your options. I understand them perfectly, Mr. Thornton. Claire's voice could have cut glass. I understand that you're a man who views marriage as a transaction, women as household acquisitions, and love as an inconvenient complication. I understand that you came here hoping to undermine Ethan's confidence in my integrity, and I understand that you're leaving now before I forget my manners entirely. Thornton's smile faltered. Mrs. Rowan, I meant no offense, Of course you did, and you've achieved it. Clara stepped closer to Ethan, her shoulder brushing his arm in a gesture of unmistakable solidarity. I'm marrying Ethan Cole because I choose to. Because he's a good man who treats my children with kindness and me with respect. Because he doesn't view my circumstances as leverage or my affection as something to be purchased. Now, I believe you have business elsewhere." For a moment, Thornton looked like he might argue. Then he caught the expression on Ethan's face and seemed to think better of it. He mounted his horse with poor grace. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Rowan. Cole's ranch is half the size of mine, his prospects half as good. But if you prefer poverty and sentiment to security and prosperity, that's your choice to make." "Yes," Clara agreed. "It is. Good day, Mr. Thornton." They watched him ride away, and only when he'd disappeared over the rise did Ethan let out the breath he'd been holding. "That was infuriating," Clara finished. "The presumption of that man coming here and suggesting I'm some kind of fortune hunter. He suggested I was a fool being manipulated. Which is even worse." Clara turned to face him fully. "You're not having doubts, are you, because of what he said?" "No." Ethan pulled her close, feeling the rightness of her in his arms. "I know why you're marrying me, Clara, and it's not for my ranch or my money or anything else Thornton suggested." "Why am I marrying you then?" "Same reason I'm marrying you, because alone we're just surviving. Together we have a chance at something better." Clara rose on her toes and kissed him, fierce and quick. Much better answer than Thornton's transactional nonsense, though I have to say, I enjoyed putting him in his place. "I noticed. Remind me never to get on your bad side." "Too late. You're stuck with all my sides now, good, bad, and terrifyingly protective." They stood there in the afternoon sun, and Ethan marveled at how much his life had changed in just 6 weeks, how Clara and her children had transformed his empty house into something warm and vital, how fear had given way to hope, isolation to connection. "3 more days," Clara said softly, then it's official." 3 more days, Ethan agreed. "Think you'll change your mind?" "Not a chance. You're stuck with me, Ethan Cole, for better or worse, in sickness and health, until death parts us." "Those are the wedding vows." "I know. I'm practicing." Clara smiled up at him. "How am I doing?" "Perfect," Ethan said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Absolutely perfect. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of clarity that only October in Texas could provide. Sky so blue it hurt to look at, air crisp enough to bite, and sunlight that turned the prairie grass to gold. Ethan stood on his porch watching the dawn break, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, and tried to reconcile the man he'd been 2 months ago with the man he was about to become. 2 months. That's all it had taken for his entire life to transform, for his carefully constructed solitude to crumble beneath the weight of 3 children's laughter and 1 woman's quiet strength, for his conviction that isolation meant safety to reveal itself as the lie it had always been. The door opened behind him, and Miguel stepped out, already dressed in his Sunday best despite the early hour. "You're up early, Patron. Or should I start calling you nervous bridegroom?" Ethan managed a slight smile. "Just thinking." Dangerous occupation on a wedding day. Miguel joined him at the railing, his weathered face creasing with amusement. "You're not having doubts?" "No, just adjusting. This morning I wake up alone. Tonight I'll have a wife and 3 children under my roof permanently. That's a considerable change." "The best kind of change." Miguel's expression turned serious. "I've known you a long time, Ethan. Since you were barely more than a boy yourself, working ranches for pennies and pride. I've watched you build this place board by board, fence post by fence post, and I've watched you lock yourself away inside it, like a man building his own prison." "That's a bit dramatic." "Is it? You had everything a man could want except the one thing that matters, someone to share it with." Miguel gestured toward the house. "That woman in there, those children. They didn't trap you, Ethan. They freed you. Don't forget that when things get hard, because they will get hard. Marriage always is, family always is, but it's worth it." Ethan absorbed this in silence, then asked, "How did you know? When you married Rosa, how did you know you were making the right choice?" "I didn't know. Not with certainty." Miguel's eyes grew distant with memory. "But I knew that when I was with her, the world made more sense. The hard days seemed bearable. The good days seemed brilliant. And I knew that whatever came, I wanted to face it with her beside me." He paused. "Sound familiar?" It did. More than Ethan wanted to admit. Inside the house, he could hear movement beginning, Clara's soft voice, the children's excited whispers. Today was a big day for all of them, not just him and Clara. Today they officially became a family, bound not just by circumstance or convenience, but by choice and commitment. "I should get ready," Ethan said. "People will start arriving in a few hours. Go." "And Ethan?" Miguel waited until he turned back. "She's lucky to have you, but you're lucky to have her too. Remember that." The wedding was to be simple, held right here at the ranch with the minister from town and whatever neighbors chose to attend. Clara had insisted she didn't need anything elaborate. No fancy dress, no grand celebration. Just the vows, the commitment, and the people who mattered. But when Ethan emerged from his bedroom an hour later, dressed in the new suit he'd bought in town, he found that simple had been transformed into something quietly beautiful. Clara and Martha Miller must have been conspiring, because the main room had been decorated with wildflowers in mason jars, the table covered with a white cloth he'd never seen before, and chairs borrowed from neighbors arranged in neat rows. Samuel appeared from the bedroom, looking uncomfortable in a borrowed suit that was slightly too large. Behind him came Noah, practically vibrating with excitement, and Lily wearing a dress that Clara must have stayed up half the night finishing, blue calico with white ribbons that made her look like a tiny princess. "Mr. Cole!" Lily ran to him, then stopped short, suddenly shy. "You look different." "So do you, miss. Very grown up. Mama says today is special, that after today, you're going to be our real papa." The words landed with unexpected weight. Ethan knelt down to her level, aware of the boys watching from across the room. "That's right. Is that all right with you?" Lily considered this with her characteristic seriousness. Then she nodded decisively. "Yes, because you already act like a papa. You read stories and fix things and make Mama smile, so you might as well be official." The simple logic of childhood, cutting through complexity to reach truth. Ethan pulled her into a quick hug, then stood to find Samuel watching him with an expression that was equal parts hope and wariness. "You look good, Samuel. Very handsome." "Thank you, sir." The boy's formality was armor, protection against disappointment. But there was something else there, too. A tentative reaching out, barely visible, but present nonetheless. Noah bounded over, unable to contain himself any longer. "Is it true we get cake? Martha Miller said there's cake." "It's true. After the ceremony." "And then you and Mama are married forever?" "That's the plan." "Good." Noah's grin was infectious. "Samuel was worried you might change your mind, but I told him you wouldn't. You're not like that." Samuel's face flushed. "I wasn't worried. It's smart to be cautious." "It is," Ethan agreed. "And I'm glad you're looking out for your mother and your siblings. That's exactly what a good son does." He paused. "But today you can relax. I'm not going anywhere." Before Samuel could respond, the sound of arriving wagons drew their attention to the windows. Neighbors were beginning to arrive, some curious, some genuinely happy for them, all dressed in their Sunday finest. Martha Miller bustled in with her husband in tow, immediately taking charge of final preparations. Doc Harrison arrived with his wife. Miguel brought his entire extended family, 3 generations filling the small house with warmth and noise. And through it all, Clara remained in the bedroom, invisible but present, the reason for this gathering. The minister arrived precisely on time. Reverend Samuels, a practical man who understood frontier life and didn't waste words. He positioned himself by the fireplace while the guests found seats, children squirming on their parents' laps, adults whispering behind their hands. Ethan took his place beside the minister, his heart hammering against his ribs. Miguel stood beside him, serving as witness, and the 3 children arranged themselves on his other side. Noah bouncing on his toes, Lily clutching Annabelle, Samuel standing rigid with responsibility. Then the bedroom door opened and Clara emerged. She wore a dress of deep green, not white, which would have been inappropriate for a widow's remarriage, but a color that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes and the richness of her auburn hair. The dress was simple, well made but not elaborate, and she'd pinned her hair up with small white flowers that Miguel's daughter must have provided. She was beautiful. Not in the decorative way of women who spent hours on their appearance, but in the authentic way of someone comfortable in their own skin, confident in their choices, certain of their path forward. Their eyes met across the room, and Ethan saw his own emotions reflected back: nervousness, excitement, certainty, hope. Clara smiled, small and private, just for him, and began walking toward him down the makeshift aisle. She moved alone, no father to give her away, no family to witness her second chance at happiness. Just Clara, choosing her own future with clear eyes and an open heart. When she reached him, she handed her small bouquet to Lily and took Ethan's offered hands. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "Ready?" she whispered. "Absolutely." Reverend Samuels cleared his throat and began. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Ethan Cole and Clara Rowan in holy matrimony. Marriage is not an institution to be entered into lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in full understanding of the commitment being made." The familiar words washed over Ethan, but his attention was focused entirely on Clara. The way the light caught in her hair, the small smile playing at her lips, the strength in her grip on his hands. "Ethan, do you take Clara to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death parts you?" This was it. The moment of commitment, of choosing connection over isolation, of embracing the risk that came with loving someone who could be lost. "I do." Clara's smile widened, and Ethan saw moisture gathering in her eyes. "Clara, do you take Ethan to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death parts you?" "I do." Her voice rang clear and certain through the room. "The rings?" Miguel produced 2 simple gold bands, nothing elaborate but solid and well-made, purchased in town with more care than Ethan had ever given to any purchase. He'd chosen them with Clara's input, both of them agreeing that simplicity suited them better than ostentation. Ethan took Clara's ring and slipped it onto her finger, his voice steady as he repeated the minister's words. "With this ring I thee wed. All that I have I share with you." Clara's turn, and her hand shook slightly as she placed the band on Ethan's finger. "With this ring I thee wed. All that I am I share with you. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Texas, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Reverend Samuels smiled. "You may kiss your bride." Ethan pulled Clara close and kissed her, gentle and brief, mindful of their audience but unable to hide the emotion behind it. When they broke apart, the room erupted in applause and cheers, the children clapping loudest of all. They turned to face their guests as husband and wife, and Ethan felt the weight of it settle over him. Responsibility, yes, but also belonging. For the first time in 13 years, he belonged to something larger than himself, to someone other than himself. The celebration that followed was loud, chaotic, and wonderful. Martha Miller had indeed brought cake, 3 layers of it, decorated with more wildflowers. There was food enough to feed everyone twice over, contributed by neighbors who'd clearly decided that regardless of how quickly this marriage had happened, it deserved proper celebration. Ethan found himself swept into conversations, accepting congratulations and good-natured ribbing about his bachelor days being over. Beside him, Clara navigated the social currents with practiced grace, thanking people for their kindness while deflecting the more intrusive questions about their courtship. "Quite a whirlwind romance," one of the neighbor women said, her tone suggesting she found it slightly scandalous. "When you know, Clara replied smoothly. "And I've learned that life is too short to waste on unnecessary waiting." Later, as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows and children ran wild in the yard, Ethan found himself standing beside Samuel. The boy had been quiet during the festivities, watching everything with those 2 old eyes. "You all right?" Ethan asked. "I'm fine." "Samuel." The boy's jaw tightened. Then, in a rush, "What if I can't do this? Be part of your family, call you Papa, pretend everything's fine." "Who said anything about pretending?" Ethan led him away from the crowd, out onto the porch where they could talk privately. "This isn't about pretending, Samuel. It's about building something new while respecting what came before." "But Papa..." "Your papa was your papa. Nothing changes that. Nothing should change that. Ethan sat on the porch steps, and after a moment, Samuel joined him. But he's gone, and you're here, and you need someone to help guide you through the next years. That's what I'm offering, not replacement, partnership. Samuel was quiet, processing this. Finally, what if I'm too angry, too broken? What if I ruin everything? The raw honesty of it pierced Ethan's heart. This boy, carrying so much weight, convinced his damage would poison whatever he touched. You're not broken, Samuel. You're hurt, and that's different. Hurt can heal if you let it. Ethan paused. And anger? Anger's just fear wearing a different face. You're afraid to trust me, afraid to hope things might actually work out this time. That's normal. That's smart, even. But don't let that fear keep you from living. How do I stop being afraid? You don't. You just keep moving forward anyway. You take small risks, build small trusts, and gradually the fear gets smaller. Ethan looked at the boy directly. I'm not asking you to call me Papa if you're not ready. I'm not asking you to forget your father or pretend the past didn't happen. I'm just asking you to give us a real chance. Samuel's eyes were wet, but he didn't look away. What if I try and it still doesn't work? Then we'll figure it out together. But Samuel, what if it does work? What if you let yourself be part of this family and it turns out to be exactly what you needed? The boy absorbed this, and Ethan could see the war happening inside him. Fear versus hope, past versus future. Then Samuel did something Ethan hadn't expected. He leaned against Ethan's shoulder, just slightly, and whispered, I'll try. That's all anyone can ask. They sat there for a while, watching the celebration continue inside, and Ethan felt something shift. Not a complete transformation. That would take time, patience, countless small moments of building trust. But a beginning, a possibility. When they returned inside, they found Clara had corralled Lily and Noah, and the five of them stood together as Martha Miller insisted on taking a photograph with her husband's camera. They arranged themselves awkwardly, Clara and Ethan in the center, the children arrayed around them, and tried to hold still for the long exposure. Think of something happy, Martha commanded. This is your wedding day, for heaven's sake. Ethan looked at Clara, who looked back at him with such open affection that it made his chest tight. Around them, their children, because that's what they were now, their children, tried to maintain serious expressions and failed, small smiles breaking through despite their best efforts. The camera clicked, capturing that moment forever. A family, new and uncertain but genuine. A man who'd learned that strength came from connection, not isolation. A woman who'd chosen hope over safety. 3 children learning to trust again. Later, after the guests had departed and the house was quiet again, Ethan and Clara stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Inside, the children were settling into their evening routines, Samuel reading to his siblings before bed, a responsibility he'd claimed as his own. How are you feeling, husband? Clara asked, the word still new and slightly foreign on her tongue. Grateful. Terrified. Happy. Ethan pulled her close. How about you, wife? All of those things. Plus relieved that it's official now. No more uncertainty, no more temporary arrangements. Just us, building something permanent. Speaking of building, Ethan said, I've been thinking. The house is getting crowded with all of us. I was planning to add on another room or two, maybe build a proper bedroom for the boys so Lily can have her own space eventually. That's a wonderful idea, though it can wait until spring, surely. Probably, but I like planning for it, like having a future to build toward. Clara turned in his arms, her expression serious. I love you, Ethan Cole. I know I said I wasn't there yet when you proposed, but somewhere between then and now, it happened. Maybe during Samuel's accident, watching you ride through that storm. Maybe when you stood up to Thornton. Maybe it was gradual, built through 1,000 small moments. But it's real, and it's true, and I wanted you to know. The words landed like a benediction, a gift Ethan hadn't expected but desperately needed. He kissed her, deep and thorough, pouring everything he felt into it. I love you too, he said when they finally broke apart. And I love those children in there. Our children. Our children, Clara repeated, savoring the phrase. That's going to take some getting used to. We have time. We have the rest of our lives. They stood there as darkness fell over the prairie, the stars beginning to emerge overhead. From inside came the sound of Samuel's voice reading a story, Noah's occasional interjections, Lily's sleepy questions, the sounds of home, of family, of life being lived fully instead of merely survived. 6 weeks ago, Ethan had stood on a train platform prepared to redirect strangers toward cheap lodging. 6 weeks ago, he'd been convinced that his carefully constructed solitude was the only life worth living. 6 weeks ago, he'd been surviving, but not truly alive. Now everything had changed. His empty house was full of voices and laughter. His solitary meals had become family gatherings. His future, once stretching ahead as predictably as fence posts, now held infinite possibilities. Children growing up, love deepening, a ranch transformed from refuge into home. "Thank you," Clara said softly. "For what?" "For having room for 4. For taking a chance on a desperate widow and her complicated children. For choosing us when you could have chosen the easier path." "You think the past 6 weeks have been easy?" Ethan laughed. "Clara, you've turned my entire life upside down. Is that a complaint?" "It's a compliment, the highest compliment." He kissed her forehead. "I needed my life turned upside down. I needed you to show me that what I thought was strength was really just loneliness wearing armor." The bedroom door opened and 3 children emerged in their nightclothes. Samuel led the way, looking slightly embarrassed but determined. "We wanted to say good night," he said, "to both of you, together." It was a small thing, perhaps, but Ethan recognized it for what it was, an acceptance, an acknowledgement that the family configuration had changed and this was their new normal. "Come here," Clara said, opening her arms. The children descended on them in a tangle of limbs and laughter, all 3 trying to hug both adults at once. It was chaotic and ungraceful and absolutely perfect. "To bed now," Clara said after a moment. "It's been a long day." "Will you tuck us in?" Lily asked. "Both of you?" So they did, following the children into the bedroom that had been Clara's alone but would now be shared by husband and wife. They tucked Lily into the small bed Clara had fashioned for her, listened to Noah's excited recounting of his favorite parts of the day, and endured Samuel's awkward but genuine goodnight. When they finally closed the door and headed to what would be their bedroom, Ethan felt the weight of the day settle over him. Not heavy exactly, but significant. Today had changed everything, formalized what his heart had already known. He had a family now, a wife who challenged him and complimented him in equal measure. Children who needed him and were teaching him how to need in return. A future that was uncertain and complicated and infinitely more valuable than the empty certainty he'd clung to for so long. "What are you thinking?" Clara asked as they prepared for bed. "That I'm the luckiest man in Texas, possibly the entire West." "Now you're just being sentimental." "I'm being honest." Ethan pulled her close, marveling that he had the right to do so now, that she was his wife, his partner, his future. 2 months ago, I thought I had everything I needed. Turns out I had nothing that mattered. And now? Now I have everything that matters. You, the children, this family we're building together. He paused. It scares me sometimes, how much I have to lose now. But it would scare me more to go back to how things were. Clara kissed him softly. Then we'll be scared together. And we'll build this life together. And when things get hard, because they will get hard, we'll face them together. Together, Ethan agreed. I like the sound of that. They settled into bed and Ethan lay awake long after Clara's breathing had deepened into sleep. Through the wall he could hear the children's soft sounds, Samuel's occasional restless turning, Noah's quiet sleep-talking, Lily's gentle snores. His family, his responsibility, his joy. The frontier had taught him that survival meant isolation, that strength meant standing alone, that walls were necessary protection against an uncaring world. But Clara and her children had taught him something different. They'd taught him that the frontier's greatest strength wasn't individual toughness, but collective resilience. That walls built to keep pain out also kept joy from getting in. That the courage to be vulnerable was greater than the courage to be invulnerable. He told Clara he had room for 4, but that had been a lie. He'd had no room at all. His house was full, his life complete, his heart closed off to new possibilities. But somehow, impossibly, they'd made room. They'd carved out space in his carefully ordered existence and filled it with chaos and love and the messy reality of family. They'd taken his fortress and transformed it into a home. And in doing so, they'd saved him from a life he hadn't even realized was slowly killing him. A life of safety purchased at the cost of meaning. A life of protection that protected him from nothing except the possibility of happiness. Outside, an owl called through the darkness. The wind moved through the prairie grass with a sound like water. The house settled around them, solid and real and full of sleeping people who trusted him to keep them safe. Ethan Cole, who 2 months ago had wanted nothing more than to be left alone, now couldn't imagine being alone ever again. The woman beside him, the children down the hall, they were his now, and he was theirs, bound not by blood but by choice, not by obligation but by love. He'd said he had room for 4, and they'd taken him at his word. Now, lying in the darkness with his wife sleeping beside him and his children breathing softly nearby, Ethan realized the truth. He didn't have room for 4. He had room for everything that mattered, room for love and fear and hope and family, room for the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of life lived in connection rather than isolation. Room for a future he'd stopped believing was possible, room for home. And that, Ethan thought, as sleep finally claimed him, was worth more than all the carefully constructed solitude in the world.